Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Supermarketers podcast, where marketers level up with AI, specifically around content and large language models. So today is a special guest. We have Kaylin Barnes, who is the co-founder of Gauge, an LLM visibility tool, a leading LLM visibility tool. Kaylin, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So this is a hot topic, a lot of interest, and not necessarily a lot of data to back it up. You're in the interesting position of having all of this data in terms of tracking. But first, can we just start with a little bit of background on Gauge, the product, the tool, and your perspective on the market in terms of LLM visibility, answer engine optimization, and how it differs from SEO?
Yeah, 100%. So, Gauge is a platform or tool that helps companies show up more in AI answers. The way we do that is actually relatively straightforward. We basically are running a very large library of prompts that we build from a variety of intent signals to understand what the current landscape is. So, where your brand shows up and where your brand does not show up. We can then see the sources that lead to those answers being built, basically reverse engineer how those answers are getting compiled, and target the specific sources, pieces of content, gaps that we see, things that are working for your competitors to create a landscape of data that is accessible to the AI, to the LLMs when they're going to compile these answers for your actual users who are out there looking to get this data.
So I think what's really interesting, and there are some options out there now that are offering this, and maybe there are different approaches. I don't necessarily know the nuances of how others are doing it, but if
Yeah.
you could walk me through like how I would do this manually. So I would come up with, some might offer 50, 100, 200 prompts that I might be asking if I were a potential customer, or in the ideal customer profile of a company. Let's just say, for example, it's HubSpot. And so, can you walk me through the process of manually how I would do this, if it were, if we were doing the process that you're doing in an automated software platform?
Yeah, so it's basically the equivalent of building out a library of questions or prompts that the target users, the target personas or ICP that HubSpot would be targeting might be asking. And there's a number of different signals that we can look to build out that library. We look at actual kind of real SEO data. That's kind of the only first party piece of data we have on what people are asking and searching. It's definitely different than maybe what people are asking and searching in the ChatGPT world, but we have seen a lot of correlation. There are some sources of data out there, basically panelist data or clickstream data that are able to kind of pull in and get those questions. But if you were doing this yourself, you'd probably have to mostly generate the questions or come up with them yourself. People can mine sources like Reddit. They can mine sources like their sales calls to understand and figure out what people might be asking about their product or about the space. You would then take those questions and run them and look at the answers. The thing that becomes very hard is doing that at scale, doing that continuously. And there are quite a few gotchas that actually exist within that. So, one is the APIs for the models actually return very different responses and sources as compared to the actual chat experiences. So, you need to be running the actual ChatGPT interface and pulling the data from that interface. That becomes very hard to do at scale. The other gotchas are, ChatGPT is heavily influenced by who you are, your previous chats, and your history. And so if I'm a marketer at HubSpot asking questions about HubSpot every day, the model's actually going to very much change the responses that you get and that you see based on who you are. And that's something that's quite different from, kind of the SEO landscape where Google does do some personalization to results, especially based on location, but significantly less than what we see with the model providers. And so the way that we work around those gotchas is we are actually going out and gathering data from the actual web experience from these model providers. And we're also using anonymous logged out sessions with no history to get as close to the ground truth as possible, in as much as there is one for these models.
Great. So then the output, whether your platform or others, is you're ultimately getting an overview of what people are seeing, what the uh, HubSpot would be mentioned as opposed to like others in this space, competitors. But one of the things that's like interesting now, and also maybe you're seeing this from the user perspective in data, is people would be going to ChatGPT for high level, top of funnel, informational stuff. But as this translates to actually creating content, is it most valuable then to focus on the conversion focused bottom of funnel stuff, because that's where ultimately you'll get the clicks?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this. Clicks are very kind of finicky in this world because, I think the ultimate goal, I mean, it's actually been Google's goal for a long time, but especially for these generative models, is really a zero-click experience, right? The LLM can kind of serve you the data you're looking for without you ever leaving their walled garden. And they're actually quite successful at doing that. If I have an informational query, ChatGPT can answer it, 99% of the time. The thing that's still important about targeting informational content for brands is that it's an opportunity for your brand to get mentioned. So, even if I'm asking a very kind of informational set of questions about, what, for example, for HubSpot, what is a CRM? What can it do? Or like, what types of marketing software are out there that can help me with these various use cases or pain points? A lot of that informational questions, you want HubSpot to still be the source of the data for that answer for a couple of reasons. One is there is potential and an opportunity that a user does click through to that informational source. It's much lower for AI, but it still is an opportunity to capture some traffic and clicks. But the other is that it's actually an opportunity for HubSpot to still insert itself as an authority in the answer. And so we'll see a lot of brands target, getting into these answers under the context of, like, according to HubSpot, here's, kind of your informational answer. And that can kind of still build brand presence in AI.
So ultimately, it in that sense comes down to having first party data, or including your experience, your expertise in this specific post, and that might increase your likelihood of being included in the citation.
100%. So, there's still very much a need for in-depth content across, kind of all the parts of the funnel. Absolutely kind of, the commercial intents and those pieces are something that you want to have a lot of coverage of and have a lot of data for, have a lot of well-ranking, well-producing content for, but we still see value kind of, all the way from informational to commercial.
Got it. Okay. So if somebody's given a limited set of time and resources, say like 5 hours per month to increase your AI visibility, what would the rank order priorities be? So for example, is it like focusing on the schema? Is it focusing on the backlink, building up backlinks? Is it focusing on creating studies? What are you seeing as the lowest effort, highest impact initiatives?
Yeah, I'll give you kind of like the short answer, then the long answer. So the short answer is that writing new content tends to be by far the easiest lever to pull. There are some technical things you can do. You can introduce schema.json, you can add FAQs, you can structure your pages a little bit more, work on a variety of other things. There's maybe some other technical things that can have a lot of leverage, but the number one thing we see be effective is actually just writing new content. And what that content looks like, content that's written to grow your brand presence in AI is different than content you'd write for Google, or specifically really for humans. And to unpack that a little bit, when a user enters a prompt into, we'll use ChatGPT as an example, but this happens for kind of the majority of the models. The model will actually build out a set of keywords to go do searches for. So let's say I'm asking, kind of in your HubSpot example, like, what is the best CRM for my business? ChatGPT will go run a few searches, maybe best CRM or best CRM 2025. It will look at those results. The core difference is, as a human, if I search best CRM, I'm probably going to only look at the first like 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 5 pages and open up those blue links, maybe read some stuff. ChatGPT can do this very differently. So models don't have that constraint. They can look at the first 50 to 60 results, and what they'll then actually try and do is correlate those results back to the original question. So the question is taken, I'm sure you're familiar with like query fan out. The query fan out occurs, a number of different keywords are run, and then the results are correlated back to the original question. And through this correlation, what we see is that it matters a lot less to be in that kind of like 1 through 3 position. For Google, it's everything, right? Like a user is not going to go to the third page of results and click on a link, but ChatGPT absolutely will surface results from kind of that long tail. And what that means is that you can tweak your strategy a little bit when it comes from SEO to geo, AEO, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of like folks out there saying like, hey, okay, like, SEO is dead. You need a whole new strategy throughout the old playbook. We definitely don't see that in the data. Companies that are doing a great job of SEO tend to do a very, very good job and show up well in AI. But the nuanced difference in the strategy is really around targeting that long tail and getting into as many long tails of SERPs as possible, rather than fighting it out for that kind of pole position, if that makes sense. And so if I really were to just boil it down, it's kind of writing net new content, but writing net new content that targets kind of the like long tail of results for as many keywords as possible, rather than pushing, trying to build authority and grind your way up to that like 1 through 3 position where there's a ton of traffic. And a really good summarization of this I heard recently was, if you think about SEO, there's kind of like a fat head and a very thin tail, where the first 3 results get like all the traffic. We kind of see the opposite in AI, where there's actually a relatively thin head and a really fat tail. So there's a lot of value you can get out of being in that long tail.
Yeah, that is really interesting. SEMrush also did a study maybe like a few months ago on some of the takeaways over millions of queries, and it was similar that it was content ranked in like 21 plus that actually got cited in these studies. And the takeaway there, similar to what you're saying, is it's actually more about relevance and answering the specific question, as opposed to like, are you covering a broad topic like best CRMs for SMBs, like a HubSpot might.
Yeah, 100%. And the actual impact of this is really interesting too, because we can see results. I think, you might have seen some of our case studies. We're able to see impacts for clients much, much quicker, because what you're actually trying to do is kind of crack the top 50, kind of SERP for a bunch of terms, rather than fight for that like number 1, number 2 position on a highly competitive keyword that may have a lot of volume, where there's a ton of energy and effort being spent. And you'll very commonly hear SEO takes 3 months, it takes 6 months. Like, you have to give it time, you have to work on your domain authority and do all these link building practices and all of these things. And again, not that playbook is no longer true. Like, there's absolutely utility in doing and following those practices, but we can see results much, much faster, because the primary goal is actually to just get into these long tails.
Right. So if we could expand on the process. So you're going to be focusing on creating net new content. You're going to be focusing on creating very specific long tail answers to questions. And ideally in that content, what I've heard is maybe you want to structure your H2 in the form of a question, because LLMs are looking for snippets to answer questions. And then you're going to like, what are you doing beyond that? Like, so you're going to index it in Google and Bing. Are you also seeing like the correlation of backlink efforts or mentions on, say, a Reddit, Quora, YouTube? What are those other things beyond or after you're creating the net new content?
Yeah, there's like 4 main activities that we kind of help support both with our platform and that we just generally see be successful. So again, the number one I think that we actually see the most success with is just writing net new content, targeting the gaps that we're seeing, within your space as a result of the data that we collect on our platform. The second is actually refreshing existing content. So if you have a content library, we can start to measure the performance of that with respect to AI specifically. So we can look at the refer traffic. ChatGPT now does pass a UTM source, so we can see the relative performance based on click-throughs that you're getting from AI for those pages. But we can also actually see the relative citation rates and mention rates, and we'll maybe get into some of the stats a little bit later around exactly what those things mean and how you should think about them. But writing net new content, auditing and updating existing content. And then the 2 other key channels are very much social. So things like Reddit, things like LinkedIn. We definitely see Medium, a number of these other channels be very, very effective. Reddit is pretty much by far and away the number 1 source for ChatGPT. It actually depends a little bit on the industry. So if you're in a regulated industry like finance or healthcare, we'll often see that flip, where Reddit is actually a very, very small source. So I think some of the YMYL stuff might be applying there. But social channels and having a social strategy is very, very important. YouTube, Reddit, LinkedIn, Medium, those websites. Wikipedia actually also, which is not quite a social channel, but also very important. And then there's also the third-party kind of content placement sites. So the paid channels, the affiliate sites, those are also, depending on the space, they can be very important. I think something interesting that we see is that you'll see like G2 and Gartner and a lot of these companies making a really big deal about how much kind of they matter for AI search. And while it's true across like all the domains, if we look across, many different industries and categories, they show up quite highly as a source. But typically within a specific category, like within a specific industry, they're relatively low and not that important. So there's some interesting nuance there. But the four main activities again: writing net new content, auditing your existing content, and then social strategy for channels like Reddit, YouTube, etc. And then also third-party affiliates and paid placements.
Interesting. Yeah, I have seen something about somebody who like paid $500 for a press release and then was mentioned or cited in ChatGPT with like that exact press release. Who knows what the longevity of a play like that is? Maybe a little bit black hat, but goes to your fourth point. But I did want to double click into your second point in terms of content refresh, because I had heard that the newness of a piece, and then you'd update the JSON so the schema reflects that it is a newer piece. But how do you identify which pieces should be refreshed?
Yeah, so simply by tracking over time. So if we're running again our library of prompts every single day, we can see if a piece is getting cited less than it was, a week ago. Back to actually kind of like some of those stats, we'll look at specifically what's the citation rate, or rather across all of the prompts you're tracking, what percentage of the time does this URL, page, blog post, press release, whatever page you're looking at, get cited? And is that trending up? Is that trending down? Is it flat? If we see a drop off in that, then that's a good sign that we need to refresh. The other thing we track, which I think is a little bit unique, I haven't seen this out here too much, but is actually specifically the mention rate, which is how well is that piece converting into a mention of your brand in the actual answer text. So a new problem that kind of exists in this Geo AEO world is models will come read your website. You may build a really high quality, kind of like authoritative source that has a ton of information that's super relevant. AI comes and reads it. It pulls out your content and serves up an answer to the user, whether that's for an informational question or even a commercial question, but it doesn't mention your brand. So you've just, kind of gone ahead and done the full flow and answered their question. And so you're cited, you're like a little bubble on the side for ChatGPT, but your brand itself is not actually in the answer or is not represented as the answer. And so another thing we measure is for your pages that are getting cited by AI, how often does that result in a mention of your brand in the answer?
Interesting. Yeah.
And by measuring these two rates over time, we can basically understand if there's a need to audit or refresh the content.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. One of the interesting things too, like the differences between AEO and SEO, might be the timeline to see some results or some impact.
Yeah.
Like, I think you had a study of a brand that saw in 2 weeks a visibility like 3 or 4x, with probably the four-step framework that you mentioned. Were there any other like parts of their strategy that increase that? And then how actually does that impact downstream, like in terms of conversion rate or leads?
Yeah. Yeah. Funnily enough, actually, for that specific customer, we saw like a really, really strong growth across the prompts we were tracking, from roughly them showing up in about 9% of answers to 24% in just 2 weeks, primarily driven again, mainly by net new content, but also a series of things across the other steps that I mentioned. The funny thing that actually happened is we were entirely focused on strategy for AI, and that company very much believes that's the future and is leaning into it. But we did actually also see like a big spike on the SEO side as well. They actually got a lot of SEO benefits from kind of releasing this content, and they were also driving humans through Google to the pages as well, which was really cool to see the correlation there. In terms of other parts of the strategy and things that were working, I'd say, if we look at the that kind of like fourth point around like the affiliate or paid placements, there's an interesting kind of arbitrage opportunity right now where a lot of these affiliates or paid placement websites charge on a like CPC model. So they charge for clicks. They're a high authority site that ranks well in Google, and so they actually get scraped by AI all the time, but AI is not clicking through to any of these websites. And so the actual value of getting placed on those sites can be really impactful to how you show up in AI without you necessarily like caring too much about, the volume of clicks. And so one strategy we've seen work relatively well is kind of pay for like lower placements in these listicles that don't maybe get as many clicks, but do garner a lot of AI citations. Obviously, if you're kind of higher up in the article, then that tends to result in a better mention rate, but it's an interesting strategy we've actually seen work really well for a number of folks where it can be quite cheap to get placement on again, like a broad range of listicles a little bit lower down to increase your AI visibility.
That is really interesting. So that would be like a G2 Capterra trust radius, or are you talking more like private blog network?
Yeah, the software listing directories definitely are helpful. We see that actually. So we see it be the most successful in kind of highly competitive spaces where there's almost like a cottage industry of content publishers for the space. So, like a canonical example would be car brands. So if you look at BMW and Toyota and Tesla, all these companies, they have websites, but their own domains do very little in terms of SEO and also AI impact. The vast majority of that space is owned by Car and Driver and Kelly Blue Book and Edmunds and these other publishers that are specific to the space. We actually see this in B2B too. So, there's websites like the CFO Club and the CTO Club and People Managing People and these other websites that they're basically like a G2 but specific to an industry. We see those perform a little bit better than like the G2s and Gartners and Slashdots and SourceForges and all of those other ones. But depending on your industry, it can vary. Yeah.
That is really interesting. Now, in terms of you've mentioned some of the differences in ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, and I've seen data. I think it came out from Profound in terms of like what the most cited sources are. Reddit, I forget if it was Gemini or ChatGPT. Wikipedia's up there, YouTube. Um, does it matter to do you recommend a different strategy depending on what the LLM is, and is there a different LLM that makes sense for different types of companies or brands?
Yes. So by far and away, ChatGPT sees the most traffic and refers the most traffic, and that's where we recommend people start. There are nuances between the models. So again, ChatGPT definitely has a really strong preference for Reddit. Perplexity has a huge bias towards recency. So we've seen a lot of people be very successful at Perplexity by just like throwing a ton of new articles in. There's some space relevance or like industry relevance to different models. So, for a lot of very enterprise, kind of like late stage products, maybe Microsoft Copilot is a little bit more important than, say, some of these other products. Gemini also is actually deployed pretty well through Google's G Suite stack. So they've been pushing Gemini out to folks who use like their Office suite, so Google Docs and Google Sheets and stuff. But again, like I'd say 99% of the traffic we see is ChatGPT, and that, or maybe like more like 95%. And then like, again, like an order of magnitude less than that would be Perplexity. And then an order of magnitude less than that would be basically everyone else. Yeah, some folks who maybe Twitter is a huge audience for care a little bit more about Grok. Developer tools often care a little bit more about Claude and Anthropic, but overall, ChatGPT is by far and away the number one. And Google actually right now is not really, they're being pretty cagey. There's Google AI overviews and there's AI mode and all these things, but we don't really have fine-grained data on like what's coming from what channel. So I think that will evolve over time.
Very interesting. So wrapping up, last question is, you're right at the heart of this LLM visibility. What excites you most about the future of AI visibility, this whole niche that's developing, and what should marketers be preparing for now that's coming down the line?
Yeah. So, maybe eating my words a little bit on the last answer where like ChatGPT is like the biggest one out there. One thing that's very exciting about the world of AI search right now is that there are multiple players. It's actually kind of a multiplayer game, right? Where SEO is far and away Google. Sure, there's Bing. Sure, there's other search engines, but you are optimizing for Google. That is where all the traffic exists. It's actually still true today. Like if you go look at data and like how much traffic has moved over to ChatGPT, it's relatively small as a percentage of that traffic, but ChatGPT is a very real player in this space, and Perplexity and Anthropic, and there's actually kind of a relatively significant number of players, which is great for the consumers. I think like we win because the space is so competitive from the model provider perspective, and that also creates interesting strategies and interesting arbitrage opportunities, and things to go after. And yeah, I mean, to kind of answer your second question, like what should people be paying attention to, what should they be looking out for? The space is evolving very, very fast. We see, basically people at the model provider labs or companies tweaking these knobs all the time. So we've seen significant changes in like what works, month to month. So very much staying on top of it, tracking this, having a strategy that can change very quickly. Taking actually a little bit more of a short-term view than a long-term view than you might do with SEO, I think is actually something that we tend to recommend, just because what we see work 2-3 months ago may not work, in 2-3 months, which is interesting because I think there's a lot of opportunity if you kind of get on it early. We're not necessarily seeing that same opportunity will be very defensible. So that's something that's very interesting. The other thing that's definitely coming is we will very likely see ad experiences launch into AI mode, Gemini, ChatGPT. And so paying attention to these channels, not just as organic channels, but as paid channels as marketers is something that I think is very important. And there'll be entirely new experiences built up around that where, if you think about how targeted you can get based on the kind of intent signals of a full conversation that someone's having with ChatGPT, I think it's going to be a really interesting space to be in.
It already is an interesting space. But yeah, that paid element is really important. Kaylin Barnes, thanks so much. This was really interesting. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge. What's the best place to find you and learn more about Gauge?
Yeah, you can reach me at Kaylin, that's CAELEAN, at withgauge.com. And you can also get to us, book a demo, check out our stuff at withgauge.com. That's WITHGAUGE.com.
Awesome. Kaylin Barnes, thank you.
All right. Thank you.